Alright, so we have a pretty big update in regards to Final Fantasy 16 and Yoshi P and CBU3 and whether or not they will continue to be involved with 16 in the overall mainline Final Fantasy franchise moving forward. And the answer might upset some people, but it also might bring some relief to others. So if any of that sounds cool to you, feel free to click the like button, and if you're new here and you'd like to stick around, you can subscribe as well. It is always appreciated. So this news comes to us from Audrey on Twitter, where she talks about Yoshi P and CBU3 and whether or not they're going to continue working on Final Fantasy 16 stuff in the future, or even mainline Final Fantasy. Audrey goes on to write, Yoshi P says that regarding Final Fantasy 16 sequels or spin-offs, CBU3 and or the team that worked on 16 will not be in charge should there be anything in the future aside from the 2 DLCs. He said his team would like to focus on other titles, and 16 gave them a lot of knowledge that they can carry over to their next project. Instead of focusing on just one title, he would like to look towards a new challenge with other titles. However, he wants to refrain from confirming whether there will or will not be spin-offs because honestly, he doesn't know. So those statements from Yoshi P, they say a number of things. I think the first thing that this kind of confirms is that I don't think Final Fantasy 16 will get any more DLC in the future, and I don't see them doing any more DLC without Yoshi P and CBU3 involved. And I say that primarily because of the new person that's taken over Square Enix as president, and that is Takashi Kiryu. He seems like someone who is, pretty good friends and close with Yoshi P. He understands what it takes to make these games, and I think out of respect, I don't think he would greenlight any more Final Fantasy 16 projects if Yoshi P and CBU3 were not involved. These are people who created this universe and this game from the ground up. And having a bunch of new creatives come in and take over would probably be very jarring, and they might end up creating something that just doesn't jive and gel with what we got with the current iteration of 16 with the base game and its DLCs. So again, I think that means that that's pretty much the end for 16, and honestly, it doesn't really need anything else. They've pretty much told Clive's story in the base game, and they've said in previous interviews that they didn't focus on other characters for the DLC because that would require them to have to create a whole new battle system that is outside of what Clive does. So if you were to focus on Cid or Jill, you'd have to create an entire new moveset and abilities specifically for them, and they just didn't really have the time for that. And Clive's story is pretty much done, and I think by the end of the next piece of DLC, that will be the end of Clive's story. There might be a different ending involved regarding what happens to Clive. I don't want to spoil anything for people who may not have finished it, but it really feels like these last 2 pieces of DLC are going to be the end for Yoshi P and CBU3, and it really seems like they just want to move on. And this is something that Yoshi P has brought up in past interviews. I believe it was around 9 months ago he did an interview with a website. I believe it was pronounced the Billy or Beely. I'm still not sure on the pronunciation for that, but he talked about his experience working on 16 and whether or not he wanted to continue on the main lines, and he pretty much said a very similar answer by saying no, he thinks that doing 16 was pretty much enough. And he goes into how painful and arduous of a task it was to make 16 because of all of the restrictions that they have for making a Final Fantasy game, and it's very different making a mainline story-driven Final Fantasy like 16 compared to something like 14. With 14, you can have like an overall structure for your story, but you don't really have to worry about pacing. You don't have to worry about open world or semi-open world environments and side quests that, help drive the story forward. And you're also not really working on balancing all of the gameplay mechanics with action-based stuff and RPG stuff and trying to tell one cohesive story. With 16, it's this ongoing epic that they can continue to constantly tweak and change things. So making those 2 things are very, very different, and it kind of sounds like maybe he didn't enjoy himself as much doing 16. And he talks about that, and he also talks about how some of the criticism he got from fans was a little painful, of how they're trying to make this really great Final Fantasy game, but there's criticisms everywhere about no command-based menu stuff or it being fully action, and there's no RPG, and issues with, the plot development. And he himself even said in that same interview that he wanted to make a game where he could just take the plot, put it aside, and focus on all of the open world stuff, which is kind of what they do with Final Fantasy XIV to a degree. So based on that, it really does kind of sound like his experience experience making Final Fantasy 16 was very draining and probably not the best experience. But there are some conflicting comments from Yoshi P. Over the summer, he was the subject of a Bloomberg article as well as Yoshinori Kitase, and they talked about the development process of Final Fantasy 16. And he talks about how, they were so successful with 14 and they really turned that game around, and the then president of Square Enix, Yosuke Matsuda, brought him into his office and offered him Final Fantasy 16. And he said, sure, I'll do it as long as my team can make this game with me, meaning CBU3. And they said yes. And throughout the course of that interview, and they get into the nitty-gritty of developing 16, and Yoshi P straight up says on many occasions that it was pretty much their game to make. They had few restrictions. And feedback from Yosuke Matsuda or Yoshinori Kitase, which does kind of conflict with what he said in that previous interview of them having all of these restrictions and having the development process be very painful, because, there's a specific section in that Bloomberg article where Yoshinori Kitase recounts Yoshida constantly going up to him and asking for feedback or asking for permission to do something. And Kitase just straight up says, you do not have to ask me anymore. Stop coming up to me. You guys are making this game. You can do what you want. So based on that article, his experience making 16 sounds very, very different from what he said in that previous article. And granted, things can change. Maybe that's how things started off, where it was very freeing and they could do what they wanted with very limited restrictions. But maybe as development, got towards the middle of things is when things maybe started to change and more restrictions got placed onto them, and then they were able to present it to the public, and then the feedback being, kind of negative may have changed things for him. And I don't think he's lying. I do not want to call Yoshi P a liar. Again, people's feelings can change, and this also might have been a situation in the Bloomberg article where maybe Yoshi P did have all of these really awful, tough experiences making this game, but in order to be respectful to Square Enix and the development team, he didn't want to bring that up and be very negative. He was very much potentially being like a good company guy and saying like, this is our game, this is what we're doing, and rather than bring up all the drama he was experiencing, he just kind of wanted to keep that to himself. But overall, I think this is the right move. Again, I am playing through the Final Fantasy 16 DLC Echoes of the Fallen. After experiencing 16 and playing through this DLC, I am very curious to see what Yoshi P and CBU3 would do with their own unique original IP, and I personally want to see that. I don't think I really want Yoshi P and his team involved in Final Fantasy moving forward. Obviously, they're still going to continue working on 14 because that's Yoshi P's baby, and he said that he will work on that game until he's pretty much dead at this point. But I would love to see a Yoshi P CBU3 game that is their own creative project that they create from the ground up with no restrictions or having to adhere to a pre-existing franchise. I want to see what they can do off of the leash, essentially. What kind of game will they go with? Will they do another action game? Will they do something more RPG driven? Will it be a new MMO? Will it be a first-person shooter? Nobody knows, but I really want to see them just kind of, put Final Fantasy behind them, move forward and create something brand new and fresh and different that they can genuinely be very excited about, but that's also going to challenge them. Because as a developer, this is something we've talked about in many of our videos, whether it was Final Fantasy 16 or the development team behind 7 Remake. As developers, they want to challenge themselves. They don't want to just keep doing the same thing over and over again. They want to create a new experience and they want to keep learning. How can they change story stuff? How can they change combat? How can they evolve the characters and the writing? That's going to feel like a fresh new experience, not just for the player, but for the people behind the games who are developing them. So overall, it sounds like a pretty crazy situation, but I think this pretty much means the end of Final Fantasy 16. Again, I don't think they're going to get any more DLC or spin-offs unless Yoshi P and his team are involved. So that is the video. I'm Curious Corduroy. Let me know in the comments down below what you guys think of Yoshi P's comments. Do you think that he really is truly done with 16? Do you think they're going to move forward with 16 without Yoshi P and his team? Let me know in the comments down below. I will see you guys in the next video. Please remember to always be excellent to one another.